Eleanor Bennett thought she had seen everything during her 8 months at the prisoner of war camp. Frostbite, malnutrition, infected wounds, men broken by defeat. But on a freezing February morning in 1945, when a German lieutenant collapsed during roll call, she discovered something that would haunt her forever. Beneath his tattered uniform, carved into his very flesh, was evidence of crimes so monstrous that revealing them could cost both their lives. This is the true story of the nurse who risked everything to expose the darkest secret of World War II. Camp Redwood sprawled across 20 acres of Alabama clay, 40 miles from Birmingham. Rows of wooden barracks surrounded by double fences of barbed wire, guard towers at each corner, and a small hospital where Eleanor spent her days treating men who had once been her enemies. She had arrived in June 1944, fresh from nursing school in Boston, determined to serve after her brother died at Normandy. The rage she felt then had cooled into something harder, a professional distance that let her do her job without thinking too much about the faces staring back at her. These were Germans, Nazis, the people who started this war, who killed millions, who destroyed her family. February 12th started like any other day. Eleanor arrived at the hospital barracks at 6 in the morning, the unusual Alabama cold biting through her coat. Inside, Nurse Catherine Walsh was already sorting through medical supplies, her breath visible in the poorly heated room. Morning, Ellie. Another glamorous day in paradise. Eleanor hung up her coat and pinned her white cap in place. At least it keeps us busy. What's on the schedule? Routine checkups for Barracks C, treat some frostbite cases from yesterday, and Colonel Harrison wants us to examine the new arrivals. There's concern about typhus. The new prisoners had arrived 3 days earlier, 50 men captured during the Battle of the Bulge. Most were boys barely out of their teens, shell-shocked and defeated. But some were older, career soldiers with hard eyes that revealed nothing. Before Catherine could continue, the door burst open. Private Henry Cooper stood there, rifle ready, face flushed. Need a nurse immediately. Prisoner collapsed during roll call. He's unconscious. Eleanor grabbed her medical bag without hesitation. 8 months had trained her to respond instantly. Which barracks? Barracks F, ma'am. One of the new officers. Eleanor and Catherine followed Cooper across the frozen compound. Their boots crunched through ice-crusted mud. Other prisoners stood at attention in formation, breath steaming in the cold air, eyes fixed forward as the nurses passed. They had learned not to look directly at Americans. Any deviation meant punishment. Inside Barracks F, guards surrounded a man on the wooden floor between rows of bunks. He wore a torn Wehrmacht uniform, his face gray, lips blue. Eleanor dropped to her knees beside him, fingers finding the pulse point on his neck. Weak and slow, maybe 40 beats per minute. His skin felt cold and clammy. How long has he been down? About 5 minutes. He just swayed and dropped during count. Thought he was faking at first, but he hasn't moved. Eleanor lifted one eyelid, checking pupil response with her small flashlight. Sluggish but reactive. No obvious head trauma. Get him to the hospital. Carefully. Support his head and neck. 4 guards lifted the unconscious German, carrying him across the compound while Eleanor walked alongside, monitoring his condition. His eyelids flickered occasionally, a sign he was close to regaining consciousness. In the hospital, they placed him on an examination table. Captain Daniel Foster entered as Eleanor began her assessment. Foster was the chief medical officer, a tall man with graying temples who had seen combat before his assignment to Camp Redwood. Status report, Nurse Bennett. Male, approximately early 30s. Severe malnutrition evident from muscle wasting. Dehydration based on skin condition. Possible hypothermia. Pulse is weak at 40 beats per minute. Blood pressure is 70/40. I need to perform a complete physical examination to identify any underlying conditions. Proceed. I want a full report within the hour. Colonel Harrison is already asking questions. As Foster left, Catherine began cutting away the prisoner's uniform with scissors. They needed to check for injuries and assess the extent of his malnourishment. Eleanor prepared her stethoscope to listen to his heart and lungs. But when Catherine pulled back the tattered shirt, both women froze. The prisoner's torso was covered in scars, hundreds of them. These were not battle wounds or shrapnel injuries that Eleanor had seen on countless soldiers. These scars were deliberate, methodical, intentional. Thin lines crisscrossed his chest and abdomen in organized rows, some old and silver with age, others more recent, and still pink. The precision was disturbing, as if someone had used his skin as paper. But what made Eleanor's blood run cold was what she saw when she looked closer. The scars formed words, numbers, names, dates, locations. They were carved into his flesh with surgical precision, a permanent record etched into living tissue. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide. "Oh my God, Ellie, what is this?" Eleanor leaned closer, her medical training fighting her shock. These markings were too precise, too organized to be torture. This was documentation. "Get Captain Foster. He needs to see this." But before Catherine could move, the prisoner's eyes snapped open. They were startling blue, clear despite his weakened state and filled with absolute terror. His body went rigid. His hand shot out with surprising speed, gripping Eleanor's wrist hard enough to hurt. "No. Please. No one else. They will kill me. Do you understand? They will kill me." His English was heavily accented but fluent. Eleanor tried to pull back instinctively, but his grip tightened. "Sir, release me. You're in a hospital. We're trying to help you. You do not understand. If they know what I carry, what I have documented, I am a dead man. You will be in danger too. Please, I am begging you." His desperation was unlike anything Eleanor had encountered. Something in his voice, something genuine and terrified, made her hesitate. She looked at Catherine, who stood frozen by the door. "Kathy, wait outside. Make sure we're not disturbed. I need to assess his mental state. Ellie, we need to report this. Those scars, whatever this is, it's not normal. We should get the captain and the colonel. Give me 5 minutes, please. Trust me." Catherine hesitated, clearly conflicted, then nodded and slipped outside. Eleanor heard her take position just beyond the door, close enough to hear if anything went wrong. Eleanor turned back to the prisoner, who had released her wrist and was trying to sit up despite his weakness. "Lie back down. You're severely dehydrated and malnourished. Your blood pressure is dangerously low. Whatever this is can wait until you're stable." "No, it cannot wait. Every day I wait, more people die. Every day this information stays hidden, justice is delayed. You must listen to me." Eleanor found herself looking into those desperate eyes, and for the first time since arriving at Camp Redwood, she saw not the enemy, but a human being in profound distress. "What is your name?" "Klaus. Lieutenant Klaus Weber, formerly of the Wehrmacht. And I desperately need your help." Eleanor pulled over a stool and sat, maintaining professional distance but giving him her attention. "I am Nurse Eleanor Bennett. Helping people is what I do, Lieutenant Weber. But you need to tell me what this is. Those scars on your body were not caused by combat. Someone did that deliberately." Klaus pulled himself into a sitting position despite her protests. Breathing labored. He placed a trembling hand over the scars on his chest. "I was stationed at Dachau concentration camp from 1941 until late 1944. Do you know this place?" Eleanor shook her head. She had heard whispers about camps in Germany where political prisoners were held, but nothing concrete. "It is a camp outside Munich. But it is not for prisoners of war. It is a death camp for systematic extermination. Jews, Romani people, political dissidents, homosexuals, anyone the Reich considers undesirable. I was assigned there as administrative staff, keeping records, processing paperwork for mass murder. What I witnessed there is beyond anything your mind can conceive. Gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, crematoria operating continuously, medical experiments on living human beings, starvation as policy, disease as a tool. And all of it documented, recorded, filed away in neat bureaucratic reports as if we were running a factory instead of committing genocide." Eleanor felt nausea rise. This was beyond any war crime she had imagined. "You are claiming the Germans are systematically murdering civilians on a massive scale? Not just murder. Industrialized death. And I have proof. Names of commanders, dates of executions, transport records, evidence of medical experiments, details of the entire administrative structure. I memorized everything I could access, every document I processed. Then I carved the most critical information into my own skin so it could never be destroyed. Even if all the official documents are burned, even if the Nazis try to hide what they did, the evidence survives in my flesh." Klaus pulled his shirt higher, exposing more scarred tissue. Eleanor saw names carved in neat letters: Commandant Rudolf Höss, Theodor Eicke, Eduard Wirtz, Josef Mengele, dates in numerical format, numbers that made her sick when she realized they represented casualty counts. Thousands dead. Tens of thousands. That is impossible. No one could memorize that much detailed information. Klaus looked at her with haunted eyes that had witnessed hell. When you watch thousands of innocent people murdered over 3 years, when you are forced to process paperwork documenting their deaths, when you file reports about how many bodies the crematoria processed each week, when you see children torn from their mothers' arms and sent to gas chambers while you record their names and identification numbers, you remember everything, every face, every name, every number. It burns into your mind like a brand, impossible to forget even when you desperately want to. I could not stop what was happening. I was too afraid, too much of a coward to speak out, terrified of becoming another victim. But I could document it. I could be a witness. I could ensure that even if I died, even if Germany destroyed all the records, proof would survive. Eleanor stepped back from the table, her mind reeling. This was far beyond anything she had been trained for, beyond her duty as a nurse. Why are you telling me this? Why not tell Colonel Harrison, the camp commander? He has direct communication with Washington. He could get this information to the right authorities. Klaus shook his head emphatically. Because I do not know who to trust. In Germany, there were informants everywhere. People who seemed sympathetic but reported everything to the SS. Here I am, still a prisoner, still the enemy. I am a German officer in an American camp. Who will believe me? They will think it is propaganda, atrocity stories designed to make Germany look worse. But you are a nurse. You took an oath to help people, to heal regardless of who they are. I am betting my life that you will help me get this information to people who will actually use it, who will take it seriously. Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened. Captain Foster entered, followed by Colonel James Harrison, the camp commander. Nurse Bennett, is everything all right? Nurse Walsh said the prisoner regained consciousness and seemed agitated. Eleanor made a split-second decision that would change everything. He is stable now, Captain. Just disoriented from the collapse. Malnutrition combined with low blood sugar can cause temporary confusion and anxiety. I would like to keep him under observation for 24 hours to monitor his recovery and ensure there are no complications from the head injury sustained when he fell. Foster performed a brief examination, checking Klaus's pupils and listening to his heart. Klaus remained quiet, watching Eleanor with desperate gratitude. His vitals are weak but stable. Very well, Nurse Bennett. Keep him under observation. But I want hourly reports on his condition. Post a guard outside this room. I do not want any security incidents. After both officers left, Eleanor turned back to Klaus, her heart pounding. She had just lied to her superior officers, concealed potentially critical information, made herself complicit in whatever this situation turned out to be. I have not decided whether I believe you, Lieutenant Weber, but I am going to do my job and make sure you do not die before I figure out what the truth is. That is all I am promising. Klaus lay back, exhaustion evident. That is more than I had any right to hope for. Thank you, Nurse Bennett. Truly. Over the next 3 days, Eleanor found herself drawn back to Klaus's bedside repeatedly. She told herself it was medical necessity, monitoring his recovery from severe malnutrition and dehydration. But the truth was more complex. She needed to understand whether his story was real or the delusion of a mind broken by war. Klaus was patient with her questions, answering everything with calm, methodical clarity that was somehow more disturbing than emotional outbursts would have been. You said you were administrative staff. You processed paperwork. That means you were not just a witness. You were complicit in these crimes. Klaus did not look away from her accusation. Yes, I am guilty. I am as guilty as those who operated the gas chambers, perhaps more so because I understood what I was participating in, and I did it anyway out of fear. I did not pull triggers. I did not select prisoners for execution, but I enabled those who did. I kept the records that made the killing efficient and organized. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I am asking for the chance to make sure the truth is known, so that those who ordered these crimes, those who designed this system of death, can be brought to justice. That is the only meaningful thing I can still do with my miserable life. Eleanor found herself studying the scars on his chest and abdomen each time she changed his bandages. The precision of the marks disturbed her, the density of information compressed into scar tissue. She saw dates ranging from 1941 to 1944, marking transports and mass executions. Numbers that Klaus explained in flat, emotionless tones represented death tolls from specific operations. Thousands murdered in a single month. Tens of thousands over a year. Why did you carve this into yourself? Why not keep hidden notes, written records? Klaus touched one of the scars gently, almost reverently. Because paper can be discovered in searches, confiscated, destroyed. Hidden notes can be found and you can be executed for having them. But my own body goes with me wherever I go. No one thinks to look for evidence carved into flesh beneath a uniform. And the pain of carving each mark, each number, each name with a stolen scalpel, it kept me focused on what I was doing. It made the horror real. It was my penance, my punishment for being too cowardly to resist. Every scar reminds me of what I witnessed and what I failed to prevent. Catherine noticed Eleanor's increasing preoccupation. One evening after their shift, she confronted her friend in their shared quarters. "You are spending far too much time with that German prisoner. More than medical necessity requires. People are starting to talk, saying you are becoming too sympathetic, too involved with the enemy." Eleanor was writing in her personal journal, trying to organize fragments of information Klaus had shared. "He has information, Kathy. Critical information about war crimes being committed in Germany. Atrocities almost beyond comprehension." Catherine sat on Eleanor's bed, expression worried and skeptical. "Ellie, he is a German officer, probably a Nazi. They all have stories now that they are losing the war. They all claim they secretly opposed Hitler, that they were just following orders. You cannot believe everything a prisoner tells you. What if he is telling the truth? What if we have a witness to genocide sitting in our hospital and we do nothing with that information? Then you report it through proper military channels. You tell Captain Foster, who informs Colonel Harrison, who reports it up the chain of command to Washington. You do not take this responsibility on yourself. You are a nurse, not an intelligence officer." But Eleanor had already moved beyond the idea of simple reporting. She had spent hours listening to Klaus recite names, dates, locations, casualty figures, each detail consistent with everything else, each fact interconnecting. This was not the incoherent rambling of someone insane. This was careful, precise testimony from someone who had witnessed unspeakable things. On the fourth day, Eleanor made another decision that pushed her further down a path from which she could never return. She brought paper and several pencils to Klaus's bedside, closing the door behind her. "Tell me everything. I'm going to write it all down. Every detail you can remember." Klaus looked at the paper and pencils, then at Eleanor, understanding the enormous weight of what she was offering. "If you do this, you become complicit in my testimony. If the wrong people discover what you are documenting, you could be in serious danger. Courts-martial for fraternizing with prisoners, for keeping unauthorized records, for who knows what else they might charge you with. I am aware of the risks. Start talking, Lieutenant Weber." For the next several hours, Eleanor transcribed while Klaus spoke in a steady, controlled voice. He started with the basic structure and layout of Dachau, describing the buildings and their purposes in detail. Then he moved to personnel, methodically naming commanders, guards, and doctors involved in medical experiments that made Eleanor's stomach turn. He described the selection process, how arriving prisoners were categorized, how the systematic murder was organized with bureaucratic efficiency, and carefully documented at every stage. Eleanor's hand cramped from writing, but she forced herself to continue. The weight of what she was recording pressed down on her like a physical burden. But Klaus's voice remained steady, a litany of horrific facts delivered without emotion because emotion would have made it impossible to go on. When evening came, Eleanor had filled 35 pages with cramped handwriting. Klaus lay back on the cot, completely exhausted from hours of remembering and reciting. There is so much more. Details about specific transports, names of victims I remember, evidence of experiments. But this is a substantial start. Eleanor looked at the pages in her hands, realizing she now carried evidence of crimes that could shake the entire world. What should I do with this? Klaus closed his eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. That decision is no longer mine to make. I have done everything I can. The rest is up to you now. Eleanor hid the pages in her quarters, tucked inside a thick medical textbook where no casual search would discover them. But the knowledge burned inside her mind. She could not simply file a routine report and hope it somehow reached the right people. She had heard too many stories about military bureaucracy, about important information getting lost in the system or deliberately suppressed because it complicated political situations or contradicted official narratives. She needed someone she could trust completely, someone with both the authority and the integrity to ensure this testimony reached the highest levels of command. The answer came from an unexpected source. Colonel Harrison announced that a visiting inspector would arrive from Washington within days, a judge advocate general officer conducting reviews of prisoner of war camp operations across the country. His name was Colonel Thomas Warren, and according to camp rumors, he was known for his aggressive investigation and prosecution of potential war crimes. Eleanor requested a private meeting with Colonel Warren, claiming she had serious medical concerns about camp conditions that required confidential discussion with someone outside the normal chain of command. To her surprise, Warren agreed to meet with her. The meeting took place in Colonel Harrison's office with the camp commander himself present. Warren was in his mid-50s, with steel-gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. "Nurse Bennett, I understand you have concerns about this camp's medical operations that you wish to discuss." Eleanor took a deep breath, knowing this was the point of no return. "Colonel Warren, I have detailed information about systematic war crimes being committed at a German concentration camp called Dachau. This information comes from a German prisoner currently in our hospital who worked in the camp's administrative section." Harrison's expression hardened immediately, his face flushing. "Nurse Bennett, this is highly inappropriate. If a prisoner has made claims about anything, those claims should be reported through proper military channels, not brought directly to a visiting inspector." Warren raised his hand, cutting off Harrison's objection. "What kind of information are we discussing, Nurse Bennett? Be specific." Eleanor reached into her bag and carefully pulled out the pages she had transcribed. Names of camp commanders and personnel, specific dates of mass executions and transports, location details, estimated casualty figures, descriptions of systematic murder using gas chambers, evidence of medical experimentation on prisoners. The German officer who provided this information memorized extensive records during his 3 years at the camp and then carved key evidence into his own body so it could not be destroyed. I have documented his detailed testimony over several sessions. Warren took the pages from her hands, his expression unreadable as he began scanning through them. The room fell completely silent, except for the rustle of paper as he turned each page. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he looked up directly at Eleanor. "This documentation is remarkably extensive and specific. How confident are you that this information is credible and not enemy propaganda or fabrication?" "I am a trained nurse, sir. I have spent 8 months examining and treating German prisoners in this camp. I have learned to distinguish between fabricated stories and genuine psychological trauma. This man has personally witnessed what he describes, the extraordinary level of detail, the internal consistency of his entire account, the severe psychological toll it has taken on him. Everything indicates this is genuine witness testimony, not invented propaganda." Harrison stood up abruptly, his face now dark red with anger. "With all due respect, Colonel Warren, Nurse Bennett is not qualified to make determinations about the credibility of intelligence information. This could easily be an enemy disinformation operation, deliberately spreading atrocity propaganda designed to undermine morale or justify harsh treatment of German prisoners." Warren continued reading, his expression growing progressively darker as he absorbed more details from Eleanor's transcription. "Colonel Harrison, I have been investigating preliminary reports about Nazi concentration camps for the past 6 months, based on intelligence from multiple European sources. What Nurse Bennett has documented here aligns closely with fragmentary information we have been attempting to verify from other witnesses and intelligence channels. If this prisoner's testimony is genuinely based on first-hand observation, he could potentially be one of the most important witnesses we have access to." He looked directly at Eleanor with intense focus. "I need to interview this prisoner myself, immediately and in detail." The formal interview took place in a secured room with Colonel Warren, Eleanor, a military stenographer, and 2 military police officers standing guard. Klaus, still physically weak but mentally determined, repeated his entire testimony with the same meticulous attention to detail. Warren questioned him intensively for more than 6 hours, constantly probing for inconsistencies, testing the accuracy of his memory. pushing him hard on the most difficult and disturbing details. Klaus never wavered or contradicted himself. When Warren asked him to describe Dachau's physical layout in detail, Klaus drew an elaborate map from memory, labeling every significant building and explaining its function. When Warren questioned him about specific commanders and personnel, Klaus provided not just names but detailed physical descriptions, personality traits, and behavioral patterns. When Warren asked him to describe the single most difficult thing he had personally witnessed, Klaus's controlled voice finally cracked with emotion. There was a woman brought in on a transport from Poland. She had 2 small children with her, a boy and a girl, perhaps 5 and 7 years old. They were selected for medical experiments by Dr. Wirths. I personally processed the paperwork, writing down their names, their ages, their prisoner identification numbers. And then I watched them being forcibly taken away to the medical experimentation barracks. The mother was screaming, fighting against the guards with desperate strength. They beat her unconscious right there on the selection platform. I stood 3 meters away with my clipboard and my pen, doing absolutely nothing to help. I was a coward. The room fell into heavy silence. Even the stenographer had stopped typing, tears running down her face. Warren closed his notebook slowly and deliberately. Lieutenant Weber, I believe your testimony is genuine, and I give you my word that everything you have told us will be used to bring those responsible for these crimes to justice. Over the following 2 weeks, Klaus underwent extensive and exhausting debriefing sessions with Colonel Warren's investigative team. Eleanor was present for much of the process, both as the medical professional responsible for monitoring his deteriorating health and as the person Klaus had come to trust most in the camp. She watched him draw increasingly detailed diagrams and organizational charts, watched him list hundreds of names from memory, watched him describe the entire bureaucratic machinery of industrialized genocide with painful precision. But Eleanor also watched Klaus deteriorate emotionally and psychologically. The process of reliving this trauma day after day, of speaking aloud in explicit detail about the horrors he had witnessed and participated in, was visibly destroying him from the inside. He stopped eating almost entirely, stopped sleeping, spent nights pacing his room. The nightmares that had haunted him for years became dramatically worse. One night Eleanor found him sitting on the floor of the hospital room, his back pressed against the wall, staring at nothing with empty eyes. Klaus, you need to rest, you need to sleep. He did not look at her, did not seem to even register her presence. How does a person rest when closing your eyes means seeing the faces of thousands of murdered people? How do you sleep when you know that you personally helped send them to their deaths, that your cowardice and your careful paperwork made their murder more efficient? Eleanor sat down on the floor beside him, not touching him, just present. You cannot change what happened in the past. Nothing can undo those deaths. But you are doing something meaningful now, something important. You are making sure their deaths will not be forgotten, that there will be a permanent historical record, that the people responsible can be brought to justice. Justice. What possible justice can balance against what was done? If the Allies execute every single Nazi commander, every guard, every doctor, every person who participated in any way, it still will not bring back even one murdered child. Nothing I do now can possibly matter compared to what I failed to do then. No, it cannot bring them back, but it might help prevent this from ever happening again. It might make the next person who is ordered to participate in something evil think twice before obeying. Your testimony, your courage in speaking out now, might save future lives, even though it cannot save past ones. Klaus finally looked at her directly, and Eleanor saw the absolute depths of his despair and self-hatred. Why did you help me? I am your enemy. My country started this war. Bombed your allies, killed your soldiers, murdered your brother. Why would you risk everything, risk your career and possibly your freedom, just to listen to me? Eleanor thought about her brother Tom, about the letter that arrived 6 months ago informing her of his death at Normandy Beach. She remembered the rage she felt then, the burning desire for vengeance against all Germans, every single one. And then she thought about the moment when she first looked into Klaus Weber's eyes and saw not an enemy soldier, but a traumatized human being carrying an unbearable burden of guilt and terrible knowledge. Because you asked me to help. Because healing people and relieving suffering is what I dedicated my life to doing, regardless of which side of a war they happened to be on. And because some truths are simply too important to ignore, even when revealing them is dangerous. The news came in mid-April. Allied military forces had successfully liberated several Nazi concentration camps in Germany, including Dachau. The initial reports and photographs that followed confirmed absolutely everything Klaus had described. The entire world was suddenly confronted with images and survivor testimonies that shocked even hardened soldiers who had fought through the war's bloodiest battles. Colonel Warren returned to Camp Redwood carrying photographs and original documents that had been captured from Dachau's administrative offices before they could be destroyed. He spread them across a table in front of Klaus. "Your testimony was completely accurate, Lieutenant Weber. Every name you provided us, every date, every organizational detail, every description, everything matches the physical evidence we discovered and the testimony from survivors." Klaus looked at the photographs spread before him. Enormous piles of emaciated bodies, skeletal survivors barely alive, the gas chambers disguised as shower facilities, the crematoria. His face remained completely expressionless, but Eleanor could see his hands shaking violently. "Then you no longer need me. You have all the physical proof and survivor testimony you require." Warren shook his head firmly. "We absolutely need you to provide formal testimony at the war crimes trials. Your testimony as an insider, combined with the documentary evidence and survivor accounts, will be crucial for successfully prosecuting the commanders and doctors. You are one of very few witnesses who observed the entire operation from inside the administrative structure." Klaus was silent for a long moment before responding. "I will testify. I will tell them everything I know. But I have one request. After the trials conclude, I want to be returned to Germany, not as a free man. As a convicted prisoner, I am as morally guilty as those I will testify against. I do not deserve to simply walk away from this." Eleanor felt something break inside her chest. Over these intense weeks, she had come to see Klaus not as a war criminal, but as a deeply damaged man who had found the moral courage to document atrocities at great personal risk, who had carried the crushing weight of terrible knowledge for years, and who chose to speak the truth even knowing it would destroy him. "You are not the same as the others. You tried to stop it in the only way available to you. You created a record. You became a witness." Klaus looked at her with infinitely sad, knowing eyes. "Documenting evil is not the same as actually stopping evil, Eleanor. Recording mass murder in careful detail does not save a single life. I was a coward when being brave actually mattered. Choosing to be brave now does not erase or balance what I failed to do when it would have made a difference." The camp was quiet on the warm evening in early May when the war in Europe officially ended. German prisoners were being systematically processed for eventual repatriation or transfer to war crimes trials. Klaus was being transferred to Nuremberg, where the major trials of Nazi leadership would take place. Eleanor walked with him across the compound one final time. They did not speak, both acutely aware that guards were watching them, that their unusual relationship had already generated considerable gossip and official suspicion. At the military transport truck, Klaus finally turned to face her directly. "Thank you, Nurse Eleanor Bennett, for listening when you had no obligation to listen, for believing me when you had every reason not to believe, for helping me become something slightly more than just another guilty German." Eleanor wanted desperately to say so many things, that she would try to write to him, that she hoped he would somehow find some measure of peace, that his moral courage had fundamentally changed her understanding of the world and of human nature, but the words caught in her throat and would not come out. "Take care of yourself, Lieutenant Klaus Weber. The world desperately needs your testimony." Klaus nodded once, then climbed into the back of the truck. Eleanor stood completely still, watching until the vehicle disappeared down the long dirt road. Catherine came up quietly beside her friend. "You did a genuinely good thing, Ellie. Whatever some people might say, whatever criticism you might face, you absolutely did the right thing." Eleanor wiped her eyes quickly. "I do not feel like I did anything significant. I simply listened to a man tell a terrible truth. The real courage belonged entirely to him. But you gave him the chance to finally unburden himself. That matters more than you realize." In the months that followed, Eleanor obsessively followed all the news reports from the Nuremberg trials. She read every article about the proceedings, about the testimony of survivors, about the presentation of documentary evidence that shocked the entire world. And buried in one newspaper article, she found a brief mention that important testimony had been provided by a former administrative officer who had memorized extensive records from Dachau concentration camp. She never learned whether Klaus Weber ultimately found the peace and redemption he was desperately seeking. She never knew whether the act of testifying helped him carry his immense burden of guilt or made it even worse. But she knew with certainty that because of his moral courage, and because she had made the difficult choice to listen and believe him, an important piece of history had been preserved. The countless victims of Dachau had voices speaking for them across time, ensuring they would never be completely forgotten. Years later, when Eleanor was asked about her time at Camp Redwood, she would tell the story of the German prisoner with scars that held terrible secrets. She would talk about the critical moment when she had to choose between blindly following military regulations and following her moral conscience. And she always concluded with the same essential message. In war, it becomes easy to see the enemy as less than fully human, as abstract representatives of evil rather than as individual people. But the moment we stop seeing our enemies as human individuals, the moment we stop listening to their stories and testimonies, we become capable of committing the same atrocities we claim to oppose. Klaus Weber was not a hero in any conventional sense. He was complicit in truly terrible crimes against humanity. But he was also a flawed human being who ultimately found the moral courage to bear witness, to carry unbearable truth, and to ensure that the world would know what really happened in the darkest corners of Nazi Germany. That choice mattered. That is the lesson I learned at that camp. Truth matters even when it is difficult and dangerous. Justice requires us to listen carefully, even to those we consider enemies. And the capacity for both terrible evil and remarkable moral courage exists within all of us. The essential question is which one we choose when faced with those rare moments that demand we take a stand. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history. Hit the like button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the courage required to stand up for truth, even when it is difficult and dangerous. Thank you for watching, and remember that history is not just about dates and battles. It is fundamentally about the individual choices that define who we are as human beings in moments that test our humanity.